Welcome to our first episode of the Peer-to-Peer podcast. We're here to talk today about everything Bitcoin, public policy, financial freedom, and politics. So I'm here with Brian Morgenstern, Head of Policy at Riot Platforms. I'm Sam Lyman, Director of Policy at Riot Platforms, and we have a lot to talk about today. First of all, Bitcoin hit an all-time high this week.
That's right.
Any thoughts on that to start us out, Brian?
Yeah, it's happening. It's finally happening. It was one of the many God candles, they say. I think there was a little bit of a delay. The ETFs were huge news. Major financial institutions finally able to launch ETFs earlier this year. It took a little bit of time for the marketing to get going, for it to reach people's sort of consciousness who were not already paying attention to Bitcoin. And now it's finally happening. And these large institutions are bulk buying Bitcoin. We have more demand than supply. Of course, the halving is coming up. But already, even before the halving, which means there'll be half as much Bitcoin issued every time a block is mined, even we're pre-halving. And there's, 10, 12 times as much demand per day, something like that, than supply. That's a recipe for the price to go up. So those of us who have been in the industry, who have been cheerleaders for this for a long time, kind of understood that it was coming. We were hopeful that it was coming. We were waiting for it, and now it seems to finally be here. Not without volatility. That's okay, because as you frequently point out, Sam, this is largely a long-term store of value. It's used transactionally, of course, in various places around the world, but as a digital store of value, at least in the short term, it's proven its metal. It's digital metal, so to speak. So big week for Bitcoin, not without its bumps in the road, which is typical, but very exciting. And I think it's getting more and more into the consciousness of your everyday American and your everyday citizen of the world, frankly, because the American stock market is the deepest and most liquid there is. So huge development, really positive and really encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I think the Bitcoin ETF continues to set records day after day. Yesterday, $778 million worth of Bitcoin transactions took place just through the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF alone. So the baby boomers are coming. I think that's my takeaway from it. You know, there's over $15 trillion in boomer wealth out there that's looking for a refuge from the US dollar, from this melting ice cube that people are holding in their hands and realizing that, you know, the cash that they had in the bank today is worth about 30% less than it was just 10 years ago, as opposed to Bitcoin, which is worth about 5,000% more. So it's incredible to see the maturation of this asset, right? I think for a long time, Bitcoin was seen as, you know, it's in its early days as something that was a little more underground, sort of had a cypherpunk origin. But more and more, you're seeing it become a long-term savings instrument, like you mentioned, Brian. Something that is not for degens, but for long-term holders of the asset. And so that's been interesting to see. And along with that, as we know, there's been a lot of developments in the policy space as well. And Brian, you've really spearheaded the legal push against the EIA survey. So for our listeners who are just turning in, the EIA is the Energy Information Administration. It is a sub-agency of the Department of Energy, and they sent to but the major Bitcoin miners in the United States a survey about a month ago. And Brian, can you just fill us in a little bit about this survey, why it was so controversial, and how you could see through the politics of it from day one?
Yeah, 100%. I just want to touch for 1 second and go back to the store of value because I was just looking into this. People are treating it like digital gold for a very similar reason to what you stated. The US dollar is inflated away every year. That's why people need raises just to keep up. And it's why our spending power has been decreasing to an alarming degree, especially in recent years. When you look at gold as a store of value, for example, just in the last 20, 25 years, the value of gold has at least quadrupled. Think back to, for most of our history, money was created by private institutions, businesses, banks, et cetera. Then it was created by the federal government, but it was pegged to gold as an international asset that people could compare money to in value. We got off the gold standard. Inflation has worsened I think since then, and now people are looking for another way to peg the dollar to value, to stop it from just leaking away your spending power. And Bitcoin is kind of the modern version of that proposition. So for the store of value really does seem to be coming true. But so the EIA issue, here's why your legacy institutions and politicians don't like Bitcoin. Because anybody with an internet connection can use it. And you can store or transfer value anywhere in the world, 24 hours a day. The bank doesn't have to be open. The government, it's not totally anonymous. It's not that the government can't find out who's transacting. They're getting pretty good at it, actually. But they have less control. So there's certain politicians who hate that. Chief among them is Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts. Many people call her Pocahontas. She has been an outspoken critic of Bitcoin from the jump. And it's because she wants to cheer on an alternative to Bitcoin that the government can control, and that is a central bank digital currency. She even held a hearing where she had professors that she had teed up to testify, where she would basically say, wouldn't a central bank digital currency be great? And then, isn't Bitcoin bad? These were her questions, basically. And it's because she wants the American people to have a direct banking relationship with the federal government so that, in theory, they could turn off your money. The most famous example of a threat like this happened during COVID when the Canadian truckers were protesting the vaccine mandate. Canadian government did not like that. So they had GoFundMe take down their donation account. They were threatening the bank accounts of members of the organization so that they wouldn't be able to pay their bills, their mortgage, feed their family, etc. They wanted to punish people for this kind of a protest. Bitcoin is much harder for the government to do that. So that's why there's certain politicians, they favor more government control. They favor a central bank digital currency. Bitcoin is the opposite, so they don't like it. It's a long intro, but here's the direct answer to your question. Senator Warren had been badgering the White House and the Energy Department to collect data from Bitcoin miners, how much electricity they use, which power companies they work with, who helps them operate their business. And she wanted this data published on a government website so that then she could go after them and say, you shouldn't be working with these Bitcoin miners. It's reminiscent of something called Operation Choke Point, which occurred during the the Obama administration, where they told the bank regulators to lean on the banks to say, you shouldn't have bank accounts for certain businesses that we don't like, gun manufacturers, payday lenders, some other businesses. So it was really the government choosing who's allowed to transact. That's the root of this. It's the freedom to transact. So with the survey of Bitcoin miners, where the Energy Department was going to collect information about our data centers, we think so that Elizabeth Warren could then pressure us and hurt our businesses and cut us off from the power supply. We sued in federal court that action was illegal. They did it. They rushed it. They declared a fake emergency, saying the electric grid was going to be threatened by Bitcoin miners. It's completely fake, made up. There's no emergency. We're actually very beneficial to the grid in a number of ways we can talk about. But so we sued. The judge immediately agreed with us, struck down this survey. The government had to turn tail and revoke it and say, basically, you're right, this was not legal. So we got it taken away. They may try again. They may try to do it a different way. And we'll see, and we'll deal with it if they do that. But this was a really great victory because it's playing chess and not checkers. We're seeing what's the next move they're going to make. They might just be asking questions now, but why? Well, they already told us why. Because they want to find a way to limit or eliminate Bitcoin mining. Why? Because they want more control over transactions in your life. That's really the root of this story. So it took a lot of words to get out, but thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no, that was an excellent overview of the situation. And it's hard to capture just the full breadth of this victory, right? Because Brian, as you mentioned, not only did the EIA have to pull back its survey for any miners who had responded to it, they were ordered to destroy any data that they had already collected. So it's an incredible victory, honestly. And you were out there since day one, calling a spade and really recognizing what was the political motivation behind this survey. So, we had a chance to celebrate as an industry a little bit last week, but of course, we don't want to rest on our laurels. I'm curious to ask you, do you see this energy front in the battle against Bitcoin? Do you see that as a front going forward, that they'll continue to try to attack us through the vector of energy? And do you see that coming through the EIA or from other angles? I'm curious your thoughts on what might Warren's next move be after the failure of the EIA survey?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just to back up for a second. So of course, Bitcoin miners are data centers. They're data centers full of tens of thousands. The industrial scale ones will have tens of thousands of computers. They look in reality a lot like a Google data center or a Facebook data center or an AI data center. There's going to be a tremendous demand for power going forward in this country and across the world. We need to generate more energy. I think what Bitcoin's opponents see is if they don't like Bitcoin, then they want to start rationing power. They want to start deciding who's allowed to plug into the wall and who's not. So I think that's a very dangerous road to go down for a free country. I don't think just because we won this legal case that the attacks are going to go away. I think they're going to try to do it a different way. There's a different way they can do the survey. If they go through a notice and comment period like the SEC just did, the SEC just issued a climate disclosure rule where public companies have to disclose their impacts on the climate. Even if you're, for example, a data center, you don't give off any greenhouse gases. You're just running computers. But they're going to impute greenhouse gases to you because the electricity that you use to run your data center has to be generated somewhere. And maybe part of that is natural gas, or part of that is coal, or some other generation that just exists where your business exists. They're going to then say that you're boiling the oceans and start to pick and choose the data. This fight's not going away. We are in the early stages, and it's going to continue not just for our business, but for really any business that's going to require a lot of energy. So I think they may go back and try to do this survey a different way. They may try to do it in a way that complies at least with the court ruling that exists so far. The next frontier is going to be water usage, and they've already sort of forecasted this. Greenpeace and Earth Justice and some environmental groups have been going after Riot and other Bitcoin miners, saying that because it requires water to operate a data center. Most people might not think about this, but for example, a Google data center uses anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million gallons of water a day, I think, something like that, because you have to cool the machines. Computers get hot, so you have to have a cooling system in the building to make sure the computers don't overheat. They can keep functioning. That often requires a lot of water. The water can be recycled. You can have retention ponds. You can reduce the amount of public water you have to draw, things like that. There's ways to be efficient, but it's a similar argument in that they think you shouldn't have any resources. So not only can you not have electricity, you shouldn't have any water to cool your computers. That's the next kind of vector. So I think they're going to try again on the power argument, and then I think the next set of arguments is going to be, oh, well, you're using too much water. When you boil it down to the facts, especially because now a lot of data centers have retention ponds and they can recycle water and they actually are minimizing their use quite a bit, that's not going to stop the haters from coming after it because, again, if you don't like Bitcoin, then you don't think it should be using any power at all or any water at all. It's not a matter of minimizing it. It's a matter of trying to erase it. So that's what I think is coming next.
Yeah. So energy, water, and then the age-old vector of attack has been money laundering, right? Illicit finance. And that one goes back over a decade, really since Bitcoin's inception. But just recently, Senator Elizabeth Warren has really been pounding the drum on the anti-money laundering front. She has released her Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, and she leveraged the tragedy in Israel where Hamas killed hundreds of Israelis in one of the worst terrorist attacks in modern history. She essentially weaponized that event to make crypto and Bitcoin the boogeyman, and to call attention to DAML, which is the abbreviation for her Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, right? So, Brian, can you walk us through why Warren's bill would be such a threat to the industry and sort of what the status quo is of that bill and the debate surrounding it right now?
Yes. So, as you rightly point out, she's been trying to exploit tragedies to claim that it was all Bitcoin's fault. I mean, this is a pretty extraordinary and extreme thing to do, to hate Bitcoin so much that you're going to blame terrorist attacks on it. It's outrageous. And it's been proven to be not true. I mean, the fraction of money that's used to fund illegal acts is minuscule compared to traditional financial avenues. Suitcases full of American dollars, for example, or taxes levied by Hamas, or payments that come through banks from Iran to terrorist groups. Those proportionally, they dwarf any kind of impact that digital assets have had. So it's definitely a red herring. Her bill, in trying to blame all bad acts around the world on Bitcoin and other digital assets, aims to treat Bitcoin miners, any validators, wallet companies, where, for people who aren't familiar, you can hold your Bitcoin in a digital wallet with private keys, and you can maintain it that way. It doesn't have to be in a bank. You can self-custody your funds, sort of like cash in your pocket, but it's your way of storing your Bitcoin. She wants to basically treat Bitcoin mining data centers, validators, wallet producers, wants to treat them like banks and force them to adhere to anti-money laundering and know your customer laws, which are designed to, enforce sanctions. They're designed to prevent, terrorist financing from happening on the traditional financial rails. This is problematic on purpose because obviously a Bitcoin mining data center, we don't custody anybody's assets. Bitcoin miners are securing the network. It's essentially a software provider that is hashing to unlock the next blocks of the chain, which determines, which are the valid sets of data with timestamps and values and addresses. You don't know who is on one end of a transaction or another. You're not the referee. You're basically, your computers, like I said, are kind of providing a software solution. That's like claiming that because bankers at, Bank of America might have Microsoft Outlook. That's like treating Microsoft as the financial institution. That doesn't make any sense. We couldn't possibly comply. And that's the point. So she's trying to pass a law that nobody could comply with so that it effectively bans the business and pushes us out of the United States and overseas, because she just doesn't want these businesses to exist because she hates Bitcoin. So it's quite cynical, number one, to blame terrorism on something that has nothing to do with terrorism. And then number two, claim that you're just trying to enhance national security when really you're just trying to ban legal businesses. So that's what's happening, and that's why we've been pushing back so hard, and I think effectively to this point. So we'll keep up our efforts educating people on Capitol Hill, trying to support candidates who understand and oppose candidates who don't. But that's kind of where things stand on her bill.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that a lot of legislators took Warren's angle on Bitcoin and money laundering hook, line, and sinker. Back in the fall when the attack happened, Senator Warren, she sent a letter to the White House claiming, alongside a Wall Street Journal story, that $130 million in cryptocurrency had been used to finance Hamas in its terrorism. As it turns out, as an industry, we did a lot of detective work. I mean, no one knows how to do on-chain analysis better than our industry, right? And we discovered that actually that number, $130 million, was grossly exaggerated. And so some stories came out correcting the record, saying that, in fact, Senator Warren's claim duped 20% of Congress. There were over 100 legislators who co-signed with her in this letter to the White House. But we were kind of putting our necks out there as an industry, right, in making these claims. And it took a while for legacy media to come around and realize that we were correct. We actually had a huge boost just a couple weeks ago, though, when the Undersecretary of the Treasury came to testify before Congress. And he actually validated everything that we've been saying this whole time, that, in fact, the claim that Hamas had raised $130 million in crypto was a huge exaggeration and that the numbers were actually much smaller than initially reported. So that was a big win for our industry. And it was interesting because last week we met with members of the Senate Banking Committee, their staff. And you could tell, and this is good news, I don't think the threat is neutralized yet, but you could tell that some of the wind had been taken out of the sails of Warren's bill because they realized there was sort of a moral panic surrounding her initial push to get DAML passed. Even so, it remains a threat, right? And Brian, you talked at the very beginning about Warren and CBDCs and how that's been sort of her plan from day one, going all the way back to a Senate hearing held in 2021 where she was criticizing Bitcoin and pushing CBDCs. Do you see her Anti-Money Laundering Act as step one in a process to get a CBDC implemented? It'd be interesting to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think CBDCs are going to be a very critical issue in the 2024 elections. President Trump, after Vivek Ramaswamy dropped out of the race, President Trump came out and said, if I'm president, we'll never have a CBDC, to uproarious applause before a New Hampshire audience. This is really getting into the consciousness of the American people. I had spoken with some staff on Capitol Hill for very senior members, as well as some newer members of the Senate. When I start to introduce these issues, I'll ask if they're not familiar with Bitcoin, if they're not well-versed in crypto more broadly, digital assets more broadly, I'll ask, have you heard from your constituents about a CBDC? And often the answer will be, oh, yes. And I'll say, yeah, what are you hearing? And they say, 100% opposed. Like, people understand that if the government can program or deprogram their money, they can control your life. That is a concept that is really cutting through right now. I do think that her bill is a step in that path to a CBDC, because if you think about money like insurance, the public option versus the private option, look, for a lot of American history, money was issued by companies and banks, private institutions, then it was issued by the federal government, then it was pegged to gold, then it was depegged, and now it's just, we have the floating interest rate model. Point being, there have been different iterations of money throughout history. I think allowing people optionality is a good thing. It fosters freedom. It fosters efficiency. The fact that people can't make bank transfers across borders in less than a few days that cost hundreds of dollars, I mean, that's unsustainable. Like, instantaneous transmission of value is the future. We have instantaneous transmission of information over the internet. We should be able to do the same with our money. She doesn't want that. She doesn't want people to have the free exchange of ideas and money. She wants control. So how do you get control? How do you leave people with only one option, a CBDC? Well, you make it almost impossible to operate another network. How do you make Bitcoin basically impossible? You effectively ban Bitcoin mining, the network that is in charge of the issuance of new Bitcoin and securing the ledger with the values and the address and the timestamps. If you can put those businesses, essentially kill them by passing a law like this, then you grease the skids for a CBDC. Because if the world is heading towards more instantaneous exchange, not just of information, but of value as well, it's going to happen one way or another. So she's trying to throw up every roadblock she can for the private options. One point on the conservative side, a lot of conservative economists want the dollar to be supreme. They want the dollar to be the world's reserve currency. It's very helpful for the United States to have influence around the world, to foster freedom, to foster our values. I just don't see Bitcoin and digital assets as necessarily being competitors to the dollar. They can be supplemental or complementary. Like I said, before we left the gold standard, the dollar was pegged to gold. It could potentially, whether formally or informally, be compared to Bitcoin or other global assets to foster more stability in the value of our money. But I'm going down a different rabbit hole. The short answer to your question is yes, she's trying to kill Bitcoin to grease the skids for a CBDC. And that is definitely her goal with the Anti-Money Laundering Act, is to kill Bitcoin businesses so that the only option left will be the CBDC. Just like she was in favor of only the public option for health insurance, no private health insurance companies, she's in favor of only the public option for money, no alternatives, no complements or supplements to the dollar.
Yeah. It's terrifying stuff when you really think about it. And a lot of people who are pro CBDC will respond to our criticisms and they'll say, oh, those are merely theoretical. There's a way to program them in such a way that there is privacy still. However, CBDCs are not merely theoretical, because the one country to date that has implemented them is China, right? And of course, China has implemented a CBDC. It's called the ECNY. And we already know that with this digital currency that they've rolled out to their populace, they're tying it to their social credit score. And I think it's telling, and even though we do have more rule of law and more privacy protections in Western countries, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, Brian, with the debanking that we saw during the Canadian trucker protest, in the aftermath of Trump's presidency as well, there is a push to control people's money. And that's something that's incredibly terrifying. And it's actually something that President Donald Trump has latched onto on the campaign trail. So we know that back in January, he came out and he said, I vowed never to implement a CBDC. And it was actually at the urging of Vivek Ramaswamy. Shortly after Vivek had dropped out of the race, he was a very pro-Bitcoin candidate. And he talked to President Trump and he said, listen, you have to come out against CBDCs. And interestingly, President Trump agreed. So, Brian, you used to work in the Trump White House. You know the man very well. So we know Trump is against CBDCs. And along with that came an interesting evolution in his views, I think, related to Bitcoin, right? A couple of weeks ago at a Fox News town hall, he had shown that he has evolved his views when it comes to Bitcoin. He formerly said, Bitcoin, it just seems like a scam. That's a direct quote. And he also said that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were a threat to the US dollar. However, at his Fox News town hall, he said, Bitcoin, a lot of people are using it. I could live with it. And so he moved from being actively hostile to more neutral territory, sort of declaring himself Switzerland. So, Brian, I'm curious from your perspective, do you see him going a step further by eventually being pro-Bitcoin? And would that be a positive or would that be a negative? Do you think there could be a chance that a neutral view is actually what's best for the industry as far as maintaining a nonpartisan status?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think you're referring to the president's tweet in 2019 and then an interview I think he gave in 2020 or 2021 where, yeah, he was not a fan of Bitcoin. So it was a big change for him in that Laura Ingraham interview. I think a couple things have happened. One is just the fact that our market, our industry has matured quite a bit. There are many use cases now. Cross-border transactions are more frequent. People are using it more frequently as a store of value. There's a lot more trust in the network. We now have BlackRock and all these other large financial institutions with ETFs. So it's become more kind of policed, legitimized. People feel safer with it than they did even a few years ago. But the more realpolitik point that I would make is that, Coinbase estimates there's over 50 million Americans that hold digital assets in one form or another. The majority of the market is still Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, and I think it will remain that way. It's the most trusted. It's the one that's truly decentralized. And so if you have that many people interested in this asset, holding it, experimenting with it, using it in various ways, who's the government to come in and tell you you're not allowed? And I think that President Trump sees that he doesn't want to alienate that many voters. He needs to add more voters, not subtract voters, in order to win the election. So I think him getting to that neutral place was certainly a politically astute thing to do. To the last part of your question, I think that the sad reality of the moment we're in is that if Trump were to say, I actually think Bitcoin's a good idea and maybe people should use it more often, all of a sudden there are people who hate him so much, particularly on the left, on the far left, who would say, well, if Trump likes it, I hate it. And then all of a sudden you're in a partisan war of, well, Bitcoin's the Republican money. And then, something else is the Democrat money. We don't want that. That's not a good place to be. This should be a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue about transactional freedom and optionality and creating efficiencies in our economy and inclusiveness. The fact that anybody can have access to the Bitcoin network, all these things are good for everybody. They're good for progressives. They're good for conservatives. It doesn't matter. So I actually think President Trump's Switzerland position is probably the right place to land. If more politicians of ours took the position, do no harm, I think we would probably get much better public policy. I spoke with a senior member of Congress recently who is very curious, very active on digital asset issues, and who had, I think, had some conversations with the Biden folks and the Trump folks about these things. And his realization was pretty startling that, he didn't start off in a very good place on these things. He thought maybe it's a scam. Maybe it's for money laundering or what have you. Here, just a few years later, he's more up to speed. He sees the value. He's excited about it. He has constituents who are excited about it. And so now I think he's seeing various people in the administration and in a potential Trump administration who are feeling that way as well. We're getting there. In other words, progress is happening, probably not as fast as you or I want to see it, but it's happening, and that's very positive. And in this election season, I think we're starting to see candidates take notice that there's some odd $100 million being spent by pro-Bitcoin, pro-digital asset super PACs to promote candidates who are open to innovation, who want to do no harm, and who are opposing candidates who are coming out, espousing the Warren agenda of kill everything except the public option. It's becoming a really live, active debate in the cycle, and it's really exciting to see. And I think things are really on the right trajectory for Team Bitcoin and Team Innovation.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second because we're recording this on Wednesday. Yesterday was Super Tuesday, and Bitcoin and digital assets had a pretty big day on Super Tuesday. Those super PACs that you mentioned were pretty key in driving some of the major victories. One of the biggest ones was the Senate race in California. So Adam Schiff, who's running for Senate in the state of California, he actually came out more neutral when it came to digital assets. So he made a similar realpolitik calculation that President Trump did. Can you tell us a little bit more, Brian, about the big day that Bitcoin had yesterday on the campaign trail? Because there's a lot that's going on there, and it seems to play into that thesis that the crypto vote, speaking of Bitcoin and other digital asset holders, that demographic of people could potentially swing the 2024 election. Could you walk us through how that might be the case and the big day that Bitcoin had yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely. So Super Tuesday was huge. There's some super PACs out there that are spending, like I said, in primaries. So this was Super Tuesday primary day to promote pro-innovation candidates and oppose anti-innovation candidates. Probably the most high profile and the most money spent. I think they spent something like $13 million in California in this Senate race. The two leading Democrats in California, and it's a blue state, so probably a Democrat's gonna win the general. Adam Schiff and Katie Porter. Well, Adam Schiff basically adopted the do no harm position of we should allow innovation to happen in the United States. We should be the leading country on these issues. So, we should have clear rules of the road, and we should find a way to help these companies succeed here in America and create the jobs here in America. Like I said, basically a do no harm, kind of adopted the talking points of the pro-innovation candidates. You don't have to endorse a specific denomination. You have to say Bitcoin is the greatest, but just saying, we should help these companies understand the rules and help them stay here in America. Katie Porter, the other leading Democrat in that race, took the exact opposite position. She took the Warren position. She says you shouldn't have Bitcoin mining. It's terrible for the environment, even though it only uses electricity. It's scammy. It's bad. She was anti. And with the influx of spending for pro-innovation, and against the anti-innovation crowd, Adam Schiff ended up succeeding in that primary. And the second place candidate is Steve Garvey, the former baseball player and Republican in California, which means Katie Porter is out of the race, and she gave up her House seat. She's out of politics. She lost. So that is a great indicator in terms of the power of the crypto vote. There are a couple other primaries. I think there were two in Texas, also Democratic primaries to promote a pro-innovation Democrat against an anti-innovation Democrat, where they were successful. So these are kind of the early test cases. Sam, what you've done some research on, I know others have as well, is that heading into the general election, we're going to see how much this is an impact. I think it will be a massive impact because there are crypto holders, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Georgia. Some of our friends run Bitcoin mining facilities in Georgia that have had a fantastic impact on their community through the taxes that they're paying, funding the schools and the libraries and the roads, through the jobs that they're creating, similar to what Riot is doing in Texas in rural areas, really revitalizing some towns. There's going to be a lot of voters in swing states who are going to see a pretty stark contrast. At least the way it looks right now, the Biden administration has been extremely hostile. They have taken basically what seems like an anti-innovation agenda, the SEC regulating by enforcement, launching this climate change-based witch hunt against Bitcoin miners, coming after our energy contracts, you name it, putting out an executive order to explore a CBDC. They have basically been towing the anti-innovation line. Meanwhile, Trump has gotten to that middle ground of do no harm. Well, for the 50 plus million holders of crypto, who knows? We have some guess as to how many of those might vote on this issue. It's a subset for sure. But in 2020, it was like 42,000 votes across 3 or 4 states, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it's something along those lines. Very small number of voters that can tip an election. Here we're talking about millions of voters who are, especially with Bitcoin hitting all-time highs, they're probably making money on this. They're getting more curious about it. They want to learn more about it. They want to use it more. And if you end up with one candidate saying you're allowed to use it and one candidate saying, I'm going to take it away from you, that could have a real impact on this election, especially when the last one was only decided by tens of thousands of votes and you have millions of voters holding these assets. It could be a game changer. We're already seeing it make a difference in the primaries in a few very visible, pronounced instances. So I'm looking forward to seeing how things improve, I think even more throughout the fall. It's going to do a couple of things. One, if we end up with that stark contrast, anti versus Switzerland, it's going to be a clear choice for those voters. Another possible outcome is the Biden team sees the writing on the wall and they get scared into getting better on these policies. I think the bellwether race to watch right now is Ohio in the Senate race. Sherrod Brown is Democrat, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. He's been pretty hostile to Bitcoin and crypto and digital assets in general. he has, I think the nicest thing we could say about his approach is he hasn't been helpful. His statements have been fairly hostile. He's been pretty unwilling to legislate to provide clear rules. So you have the unhelpful candidate, and then his likely opponent is a guy named Bernie Moreno, who is openly pro-Bitcoin, openly pro-innovation. He goes farther than President Trump to say, this is great. We should have this industry in America. We want it to thrive in America. Everybody should have the right to hold these assets. He's very vocally pro-Bitcoin, pro-digital asset. That's going to really be an important state. It's a swing state for the presidential. It's a blue-collar state that sometimes will split its vote between Republicans and Democrats. You have a blue-collar Democrat in Sherrod Brown, and then, obviously President Trump at the top of the ballot versus, and then Sherrod Brown versus pro-innovation candidate Bernie Moreno. That race is really kind of a bellwether as to, do the American people care enough to decide a race based on Bitcoin and crypto? Right now, it appears as though the answer is yes in some instances. We just saw it last night. Are we going to see it again in the fall? Very possible.
It's fascinating because it sounds like a lot of politicians have a Bitcoin blind spot. Just the fact that Senator Brown is considering legislation from Senator Warren that would effectively ban Bitcoin mining in the United States, to me reveals that he has no idea the political downside that comes with coming against this industry. And he is not measuring correctly the political upside that he seems to see there, because I think coming out against Bitcoin and digital assets, that activates a lot of people. As you said, millions of voters. We know from Morning Consult polling that there are over 3 million voters in New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Ohio alone who say that a candidate's position on digital assets could make or break their decision at the polls this November. And so the fact that you have Senator Brown coming out against actively being an enemy of the industry, I think is a huge political miscalculation. Thankfully, we had a pretty big win on the regulatory front with this EIA survey and getting it struck down, right? So Brian, right now, a lot of people are bullish on Bitcoin's price. We just climbed above all-time highs earlier this week before a steep correction, but things seem to be settling out a little bit. We're still tickling the previous all-time high. So I'm curious your take. A lot of people are bullish on Bitcoin's price. Are you equally bullish on Bitcoin from a policy perspective? How do you see the last year in Bitcoin policy in terms of bullish signals, and how do you see the year ahead?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's kind of hard to handicap. But let me start with this: that in politics, I think of it in terms of evolution. People want to avoid mistakes, particularly voters. They want to avoid mistakes, and so voters will often be motivated more by feelings against a candidate than they are by feelings for a candidate. And I think for Bitcoiners and digital asset holders, I think the Ohio race is so important because you have a pretty clear cut, here's the incumbent and he's been hostile to this thing that you care about. You could vote against him. Of course, Moreno is trying to give the affirmative side vote, motivation as well. But my point with the avoidance of mistakes is that if our community ends up, having this impact where those who opposed us lose, that then takes the negative motivation that led to that electoral outcome from the voters, and it puts it into the politicians as well. And then they want to avoid the mistake of incurring the wrath of the voters who really support these things and really like these things. I think we've had positive developments on the policy front for a few different reasons. One, this survey had been a long time coming. In 2022, the White House had issued the statement saying they want this data so that they can basically look for ways to limit or eliminate this industry. We were able to defeat it right out of the gate. And like I said, it may come back. It may not be dead. But this win and then the resulting kind of celebration, and I would say, a little bit of embarrassment on the administration side because they didn't follow the law, that may introduce some of that fear of making a mistake again. So I think that is a positive development. I think the SEC is experiencing historic amounts of pushback with a lot of popular support for the pushback, which is eroding trust in the institution. I think that will lead to a future SEC chair wanting to avoid those mistakes. I think you're seeing some of the public rising up about the CBDC issue, and you're seeing, President Trump coming out, just as an example, saying, you're not going to get a CBDC with me. If the Biden administration experiences that blowback of voters being mad at his administration for potentially moving forward with a CBDC, you'll have that similar kind of avoidance of mistake motivation. So I guess that's my thought, that our ability to kill the survey, the public rising up against, and businesses, not being shy about pushing back against the SEC, the citizens rising up against the CBDC. I think the popular tide that is rising right now has led to pretty good outcomes in these policy fights that I think will lead to even better outcomes in the future. So it's going to be a bumpy road. This is not going to be easy by any stretch. There's going to be more threats on a regular basis, but we've shown the ability to overcome those. And I think to chasten our opponents a little bit, to make them their eyes open and for them to step back and say, whoa, this is a community that's really focused. They can be organized and they can impose real political costs if we don't follow the law and we cross them. So for that reason, I'm long on Bitcoin. I'm long on our community, but it's not going to be without volatility, as always.
Yeah, sounds like Bitcoin policy, we have the wind at our back. We have a lot of positive momentum, but the fight continues. So, Brian, before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to touch on?
I think that I think keeping our community up to date and vocal and making sure that our folks understand how the government works and how we can effectively fight is going to be really important. Because I don't think people understood the seriousness of, for example, the energy department getting involved in Bitcoin and getting interested in Bitcoin. That was a major threat. But people who aren't living and breathing this like you and I probably don't know that. So I just hope people stay up to date with us. We're going to keep getting the word out, and we want you to be involved. And thanks for listening. We'll be around, and let us know if you spot any threats, that any fires you need us to put out. We should also call this the, peer-to-peer fire extinguishing podcast or something, because that's what we do every day. But yeah, that's it. Just stay up to date with us and call your congressman when you need to.
We'll see y'all next week.